let's get started. But thank you everyone for joining our February webinar. I do want to start off by saying we have 2 more webinars scheduled that are coming up before we kind of start really ramping up all of the preparations for our Swizzler All Hands meeting that I'm really excited to host again this year. And so as a reminder, the Swizzler All Hands meeting, just right off the bat, it will be June 13th and 14th. So please save those 2 dates. This will be directly after our SALT conference, the Salinity Affected Lands in Transition. And the all hands meeting kind of theme this year is going to be all about envisioning the future. And we will have plenty of time during this kind of 2-day workathon to have projects to be worked on, to break out into working groups to work on the current projects, like the ones that we've been hearing through these Swizzler webinars, and then also some opportunities to propose some new projects. So while I'm still finishing up the kind of final touches on the registration form, please start kind of thinking about what types of things you would like to work on or get out of this 2-day workathon meeting. I want to briefly introduce Ashley Helton, who will be talking about a current project working on over, under, and through the salt hydrologic connectivity and the future of the coast. And Dr. Helton is a professor at the University of Connecticut. She's interested in how, from her website, how water and elemental cycles are linked across landscapes and how human activities and global climate change is altering these cycles. And this kind of puts her in a perfect spot to set us up for talking about how hydrologic connectivity is changed because of these environmental and these managed landscapes. So Ashley, please take it away and talk to us about your Swizzler project.
Thanks, Kira. So I'm going to talk very little today. We're going to pass the mic around to co-authors. So I'm going to try to just give a really brief 5 to 7 minute intro here, and then we'll start handing the mic around to hear some case studies. So this project stemmed from the first all hands meeting. We were in a breakout group in question 3, how are water management and climate change interacting under Swizzler? And given the composition of our group and what we discussed, we decided one thing that was really needed was a commentary or a short pithy review that really lays out hydrologic pathways of saltwater delivery to coastal landscapes and how humans change those pathways. And so since the all hands meeting, I have dropped the ball many, many times on this paper, but I think we're going to be able to juggle the balls until we get this paper published. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Still lots of opportunity for author opt-in, feedback, writing, all kinds of things. We're right in the thick of it right now. So it's really good timing for this webinar. So let me see if I can switch my slides. So as Kira said, our working title, which I really love, but if other people don't, I'm happy to change it. This was our original title, and we've kind of stuck to it. Over, under, and through, salt hydrologic connectivity and the future of our coast. And so we all know, particularly in this group, that increasing salinization is just the reality for coastal landscapes worldwide. Hydrologic connectivity between these 3 pathways, over, under, and through, overland flow like storm surge and tidal flooding, flow under the ground, groundwater flow, and flow through watersheds, through surface water channels, deliver salt to inland systems. Now, unfortunately, in the hydrologic sciences, we have studied these pathways pretty separately. And that kind of separate study has really limited us from really being able to fully understand and predict where salt is delivered in our coastal landscapes. So the second part of this is water management. So human modifications to our hydrologic system alter these pathways and thus alter the spatial and temporal patterns of seawater intrusion. And so creating a framework to study these 3 pathways holistically together and explicitly incorporate human modifications like flood defenses, agricultural drainage networks, or groundwater extraction is important if we really want to be able to predict along coastal landscapes which places are going to have salt delivered and thus be at much higher risk for salinization. Um, so our logistically, we are targeting a perspectives piece in environmental research letters to communicate this idea. I didn't quite know what a perspectives piece was. So just to let you all know, these are short pieces based on contemporary topics that are centered on expressing the opinions or judgments of experts or a group of experts. They are evidence-based, but they have limited data, limited case studies, and very few references. So it's kind of like a literature-informed short opinion piece, very short, 2,000 words. They also have to discuss future directions, policy, implications, or recommendations. And that'll be an important conversation if we have time at the end. I would love to have with this group. The current draft of this paper is linked in the email that everybody got earlier. If you can't find it, drop me a line and I'll send it. Authorship opt-in, as I mentioned, is still wide open. It will close at the end of next week. I'm hoping we can target a submission by the end of March for this piece. So this is kind of the paper outline. I'm being a little bit logistical here, but it's also kind of the conceptual outline here of what we're doing. We want to present this refined framework that I just kind of briefly gave you an overview of in the last slide that integrates surface and groundwater perspectives to fully understand and predict where saltwater is delivered, and also explicitly considers how humans modify parts of those hydrologic connections or those hydrologic connections together. A big part of this perspectives piece will be using our group of experts in Swizzler to present case studies in the eastern US coastal plain that call attention to how various combinations of these hydrologic pathways and their modifications drive patterns of seawater intrusion. And then the third part will focus on future directions and recommendations. So the first part is drafted. It definitely needs editing and feedback from anybody that wishes to opt in. We're going to hear about some case studies in a minute. It would still be great to have additional case studies, hear about other case study ideas. And the third part is not yet drafted, so plenty of room for input and feedback. So I'm going to start passing the mic. I told you all would be short, and that was even shorter than I intended to be, which is fantastic. We're going to pass the mic around and hear about 4 different potential case studies for the paper. Hopefully folks that are presenting case studies will keep it to 5 to 7 minutes. I can't remember what we said. It's 10 minutes. 10 minutes, right? 10 minutes. And we'll have time for discussion at the end. And then, as I mentioned, as you all are listening to these case studies and the hydrologic pathways or modifications that they emphasize, it would be great to have some other ideas. If you're thinking about your study system or a study system you know well that perhaps emphasizes a different pathway or a different modification or brings a different perspective, we would love to hear about that for this project. So I think with that, I'm going to start passing the mic. I have Greg, Justine, Alex, and Marcelo listed in this order. It doesn't matter. This was not an intended order. This is just the order I happened to type them in on this slide. Should we just go with that order? Does that make it easy? Yes, Greg has a thumbs up and I can see him. So Greg is on board.
All right, thanks. Do we have a confirmation you can see that? Cool, thanks.
Yes.
So I'm going to be talking about the through part, I think. Using the example of the Savannah River on the Georgia-South Carolina border. So the Savannah River is a large river, but it's also a river that's been heavily modified by humans. And particularly, I think it offers a great example of how port and navigation infrastructure and maintenance can cause salinization and accelerate Swizzler effects on our coastal resources. So the Savannah port is the 3rd busiest port in the United States. And as ships have gotten larger around the world for global commerce, the port has needed to constantly dredge the channel of the Savannah River But also, as the ships have gotten bigger, they dredge more and more for a bigger cross section. So the biggest boats can get in now. And so over the decades, there have been a lot of modifications to the Savannah River. So this is a map showing in different colors, salt marsh in red, brackish marsh in green, and tidal freshwater, mostly forests in light green, as you go upriver along the Savannah River. And so the port, for example, is all along the Savannah River, just upstream of downtown, shown by this kind of orangish line. And as part of the port operations, they had the idea a couple of decades ago of putting in a giant flap gate, tide gate, on a back channel of the Savannah River. Water would come in through the flap gate on flood tide, pushing salt water upstream, but then water could not back out again as the tide ebbed. And that would force the water through a cut they made back to the main channel and push the water downstream to scour out the channel to maintain it for dredging. As a consequence, it held a lot of salt water further upstream because of these operations. So in 77, that tide gate was installed and new dredging was done. And very quickly, they saw some very rapid conversion of tidal freshwater marsh to brackish marsh. And so after a fairly short time, they decided in 1991, they decided to cease operation of that tide gate and to fill the channel, the cut channel. They had to reroute the water to try to restore the Savannah River estuary. That worked pretty quickly. And I'll show some data in the next slide. But they keep on increasing the depth of the dredge channel, first to 42 feet. The latest is to 47 feet. That is now done. It has funded a lot of research, though, on the bright side. But one of the earliest studies was led by the Wiley Kitchens group. And so Wayne Pearlstein in 1993 published a paper describing a lot of the impacts of that tide gate and modeled the salinity effects of the current operations with the tide gate. This figure shown on the left, and then modeling if the tide gate was removed. And basically the big color difference is that the hotter the colors, the more the salinity. The brackish and salt marsh communities moved upstream. And if you remove the tide gate, they expected that the freshwater marsh would return to where it was historically. So Pearlstein, Wetzel, Duberstein have done a great amount of work on this. And Jamie Duberstein in the past several years with the recent channel depth increases has gotten a lot of funding from the Port of Savannah and Corps of Engineers to do work. And so now mean average below ground salinities are back to pretty fresh over most of this landscape, down to oligohaline, the most downstream endpoints, which kind of matches this distribution of what was predicted by the model in 1993. Jamie has also summarized the long-term salinity data. And so you can see before the tide gate was removed in 1991, salinities were much higher. So I have the red lines as cutoff for freshwater 0.5 or PSU. And you can see that a lot of the freshwater landscape now did go oligohaline from a salinity perspective and a vegetation perspective. Once the tide gate was removed, it pretty quickly restored to freshwater over a lot of this upper estuarine landscape. And over the past decade or so, Jamie's been documenting that there's a continuing freshening of the wetland plant communities over time. More and more of his plots are being characterized by freshwater wetland species composition for the plants, and fewer are oligohaline plant composition. Ken Krause and myself and Jamie and William Connor have been working on the upper Savannah River and the tidal freshwater swamps for a while, contrasting sites that are continuously fresh to a little bit of salt, so a fair bit of salt causing ghost forest formation and oligohaline end members. And so we have some long-term detailed salinity too. And one thing I want to emphasize is that there's the imprint of the port and the infrastructure, which has increased the tidal prism, increasing the delivery of salt water upstream to these freshwater areas, but it interacts and is punctuated by drought. So there's a fairly large drought in 2013 and 14, which really drastically increased salinity above 2 PSU at our very slightly salt impacted site. After the drought, salinity went back down to right around 0.5 to 1 PSU. So the port is injecting, mainlining the salt upstream, but it's much easier for that salt to get upstream during droughts when freshwater discharge from the watershed is minimized. So we installed dendrometer bands on trees that are moderately salt impacted site number 3. And within 5 years, 75% of the trees were dead. Very rapid, much more rapid than we expected to happen on these rivers for ghost forest formation. And we've also just documented that this salinization has increased a lot of ecosystem processes and functions and services, from carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus to decomposition and geomorphology. So, summarize, ports and their maintenance really change the delivery of salt water upstream to our salt-sensitive estuaries and landscape.
Thanks, Greg. I forgot, I mentioned agricultural drainage ditches, and I forgot the very important tidal gates. Those need to be added to that conceptual figure. I have Justine next. Would you be willing to go next, Justine?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen? Great. Okay, so hi, my name is Justine Neville, and today I'm going to be talking about a different case study, saltwater intrusion in much smaller channels, and more importantly, man-made channels, and what happens when not only do we modify the hydrologic connectivity through putting in these artificial channels, but what happens when we also put in flow control structures. And so, we know that coastal systems have been extensively modified. Specifically in the Gulf Coast, we see this because of the oil industry. And then in the Northeast, we see this as a way to control mosquitoes. And then in the Southeast, specifically Eastern North Carolina, we have this legacy of drainage of wetlands and the installation of these artificial channels, which, as you can see, have been created in immense density. So in addition to that, as sea level has risen and the climate continues to change, we've been seeing an increase in the frequency and the severity of saltwater intrusion, both chronically, which we can see with the coastal salinity index, and then with our own data through time, through things like hurricane storm surge, through wind tides, and other very short episodic events. And so within these landscapes, to then control for saltwater intrusion and try to ameliorate the risk of this, we've further impacted the hydrology of the landscape through the installation of flow control structures, whether that be flap gates and riser structures, but sometimes unintentionally through the installation of culverts beneath roadways that not only bisect wetlands, but through artificially increasing the elevation of that wetland so that we can put a road there in the first place. And so these structures have been installed, again, in immense density, partially because the density of these canal networks is so great. But we have these unintended consequences of the installation of these structures. With the intentional structures, such as flap gates, sometimes we find that they function very well, excluding salt water far into the interior of the landscape. But then when we have things like culvert pipes, sometimes we see these unintended consequences where, especially in North Carolina, it gets really hot. Sometimes the evaporative demand of the system is so great that we see a hydrologic disconnect when water levels drop so low that they can't move upstream. And this is particularly important in microtidal systems where we don't often have enough energy within the normal tidal cycle to push that water upstream or raise those water levels high enough to connect the upstream with the downstream. And so this is just under, typical conditions that we kind of see this. But what happens when we have these extreme events like hurricanes and storm surge? As you would expect, a storm surge will overtop a lot of these structures. And when we see that happen, we often see saltwater move really far inland. But then it's important to look at the dynamics, of the water moving off the landscape after the initial storm surge. And with our particular case study, what we found with these intentional structures is that after initial surge, the flow reversal didn't really happen again, because with this particular structure, these flap gates, when we have water moving upstream, they typically turn perpendicular to flow, inhibiting that bidirectional flow in the coastal system. But with something like a culvert pipe, there's no mechanism to stop that bidirectional flow. So if during a hurricane, we have these changing wind patterns, in addition to that initial storm surge, sometimes as the wind direction and velocity changes, we can see additional flow reversals through that wetland. And particularly too, one thing that's very interesting about this, the fact that when we have these flow control structures, they need to be rated to handle appropriate flow volumes. Now, by no means am I saying that a hurricane brings normal flow volumes, but this is a pretty small flow control structure in culvert pipe. So what we saw in our data was that after this initial storm surge, because this culvert pipe was so small, it took an incredibly long time for the salinity of this system to drop. Whereas in a system or in a canal where there were 3 culvert pipes that could handle much larger flows, the drop of that salinity occurred much more rapidly. So when we're thinking about how densely these systems are, one, diked for canals, and 2, managed with flow control structures, in a future where we see more saltwater intrusion and more sea level rise, I think we need to start thinking about how we can best manage the infrastructure of these alterations, and I think this kind of depends on what our end management goals are. So like if we want to keep a freshwater system, then maybe we need to resist saltwater intrusion or sea level rise as long as possible. But if we don't mind something like a salt marsh transition to occur, maybe removing the flow control structures would aid in that transition. But as we see salinization continuing, I think resisting this change might be infeasible in the long run. And if we don't recognize that, it might lead to some sort of catastrophic loss rather than a graceful managed retreat. And with that, I'll stop sharing.
Awesome. Thank you, Justine. I like the graceful retreat language. So I should also say, I'm trying to get through everybody to make sure that everybody has time to present. And then at the end, we can ask questions to any of the speakers with the time we have left. So we'll ask questions and then we can move into any other conversation we want to have, just to make that clear. There should be time for questions. Alex, you're next on my list. Are you good to go?
I'm good to go.
Awesome.
Let me just share my screen. Okay. All right. So we've been doing some work in the eastern part of North Carolina, and Justine has kind of touched a little bit on the occurrence of these artificial channels on North Carolina. And so here's a GIS hydrologic layer that includes natural and artificial. And obviously, it's pretty easy to pick out the artificial because there'll be straight lines, these linear features. And so from this perspective, you don't get an appreciation of the differences in terms of what these features are like. Right? They can range from drainage ditches to small canals to even very large canals like the Pango River Alligator River Canal, which is part of the Intracoastal Way that tried to bridge the gap or the pathway from the Pamlico Sound to the Albemarle Sound. So instead of going within the sound or the estuarine system, you could cut across through this land that joins the 2 systems by going up the Pamlico River, up the Pango River, and then cutting across this canal that was dug about 100 years ago, and then going to the Alligator River, and then going up to the Albemarle. So this provided a pathway. But then with development of this canal, which is 35 kilometers long and 60 to 100 meters wide, and it's very deep, considering that it's a canal. This also has facilitated the movement of salt water. And so some of the work that we've done in the past has focused on trying to document how saline water has been moving up all the way from the Pamlico Sound up to the Alligator River through this feature. And then since there are other canals and drainage ditches that are connected to this large feature, even those then are impacted. And so what we did is we showed how the conductivities in this case specific conductivity related to salinity would change as a function of wind tides. And so if the wind was blowing from the southeast with a certain magnitude, so in this case, we're showing the velocity vectors for the wind, there's no precipitation, and so water levels would go up, and then the salinity will also go up, and then that driver was wind. So if there's a certain amount of wind and certain amount of wind velocity, that would drive saltwater up all the way from the Pamlico Sound, up the Alligator-Panko Canal, and all the way to the Alligator River. And then you have the water then permeating into different ecosystems in that region. And so we did that work, you know, in 2014, but then more recently, we've focused on looking at agriculture fields and how saltwater intrusion has been impacting these agriculture fields. And so here's our one example of a field site that we have in Eastern North Carolina. And so this is an agriculture field, and this is impacted by high salt concentrations. And so the farmers indicated that they have had issues. And so the fields, generally speaking, in Eastern North Carolina, the water table is pretty close to the ground surface. And so in order to drain the water table, there are lots of drainage ditches and canals. And again, these will be of different sizes and magnitudes. And so from this image of the field site, there are drainage ditches and canals sort of surrounding these fields. And so we have done a number of surface geophysical surveys on these sites to try and see what's going on. Because on one hand, it's sort of easy to say, well, yes, it's saltwater intrusion and sea level rise. But then exactly how is that mechanism manifesting itself to then show sort of like the answer, right? Like the endpoint. And so the endpoint is, and here's an example, right? Well, you might have certain patches. So there are these patches in here. How is it that, and this particular field is a prime example, it was inundated by storm surge in, I'm trying to recall, 2012 or 2013. So the entire field was inundated, and there was maybe high salt concentrations from that inundation. But then yet, when you look at the field, it's not the entire field that is kind of impacted. So when you're talking about the spatial distribution of salinity, right? Like this is sort of like a case in point. And so in certain instances, you might have these features that are maybe on the corners or on the edges of the fields, but then there are certain sites as well where it will be right in the middle of the field, or there's this patch right here that I'll show you in a minute in more detail. So how is it that you've got that distribution of salt? So talking to the spatial distribution that changes, there's that question. And then there's another question, obviously, which is the temporal. And so some of the work that we're doing right now is trying to figure out exactly why do you have those differences spatially, and then how are they manifesting themselves temporally. And so we ran some geophysics, and I'm just going to show you a few examples. So this is a field site, the same field site. And again, here are the drainage ditches, and there's another ditch/canal that extends through the road. There's a water control structure here. There's a flap gate. We've collected surface water measurements in the ditches and canals, and I'll show you that again in a minute. And then there's a temporal aspect to that. But what I want to illustrate in this particular figure to draw attention to is the results of the electromagnetic induction. So basically, we're looking at the conductivity, right? And the conductivity is being used as a proxy for salt or salinity. In this case, the reds are low conductivity, and then the blues are high conductivity. And so if you look at the location of the blues are adjacent to these artificial channels. But again, not all the artificial channels are related to these features where you have blue, right? So in some cases, there's an association, high conductivity adjacent to some drainage ditch or canal, and in some cases there isn't. All right. So again, what is driving that? In some cases, again, like here, right, and there, it's not necessarily next to a drainage ditch per se, but this entire field right here is impacted, right? And so the farmer has basically abandoned this region, and they have moved on, and so they never farm, they never grow anything on this, and then they start here to grow their crops. And so why do you have that persistence over here? And then how is that related to proximity to drainage ditches, and how has that changed over time? And so some of these questions we're still sort of looking at. But one of the things that we thought would be to obviously look at the surface water distribution in terms of the salinity. And so over time of collected surface water in terms of salinity measurements at different locations along the different ditches. And again, speaking to the temporal, right? So you have got high salinities along this canal. And then is the drainage ditch working, which is what Marcelo and Justine did in their paper, right? So sometimes it's somewhat functioning, sometimes it's not. And then you get this plume going past that water control structure and then permeating all the way into the field. And then so these are just some examples of different dates when we have collected this data. In some cases, there's a significant drop, right? But then you still have kind of like high salinities past the water control structure. In some cases, it's kind of low salinities. And so one of the questions then is, well, what is happening with respect to the through, right? So here it's sort of this overland process where it's through the surface water bodies. But then what's happening once the salt is within this canal or ditch and in the proximity of a field that the farmer is working on? And so again, we ran some other geophysics, and here's an example of some of the things that we've established. And so this is the field site, and then right there, we ran some geophysics. In this case, it was electrical resistivity tomography. You're running an electric current in the ground, and then you then capture the conductivity. In this case, the reds are the high conductivities. So at this location, this is where the ditch is located. So in the middle of the transect is where the ditch is. And then underneath that ditch, you can see that there's a large feature that in this case, we're making the interpretation that as you go across this ditch, there was this large plume of salt emanating from the surface water that you had. And so some of the things that we're currently looking at is how do these plumes evolve over time? Does it stay here? Does it move? So it started off from surface water, and now it's in the groundwater system. And then we can capture, how deep it is, how wide it is. And then over time, I don't have time again to show you, but we see that this plume, in some cases, kind of breaks apart. Some parts go this way, some parts go that way. And then it dissipates over time. And then so what was that initial driver that brought this plume in? And then do we see periodic influxes, right, in terms of the acute or chronic drivers? And so is it through storm surge and then it lingers, or is it through wind tide events and then it's going to come and it's going to go? And if there are wind tide events, are they 30 in a year? And for every of those 30, are you getting these fluxes coming in? And so again, speaking to the spatial and temporal differences. These are some of the work that we've been doing, and I'll just like to acknowledge really quickly, because I didn't do all this work by myself. Andrea Gibbs, Al Wood from the North Carolina Cooperative Extension, graduate student Elna Spazeski, who's been spending a lot of time in the field collecting some of this data, with Matri Siriani, who is new at ECU, Stephen Moisey, and John Gallet, some of the students, and of course, some of the folks that we worked with at NC State, Diana Rashash and Carl Crozier, who have retired. And of course, we wouldn't have done all this if we didn't have any access from the farmers themselves in the field. And so I will leave it there, and I'll be glad to take some questions when it's time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. Those geophysical methods are really cool. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that work. Marcelo, last but never least.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I was going to say, everybody said already. So
we are always a little North Carolina heavy, I think.
Yeah.
That's okay. We like North Carolina.
Well, yeah. Okay. Let me share my screen. Does that work? You guys can see that? Yeah. Okay. So
yes, we can see
I just, I didn't realize we were going to see 3 other North Carolina maps before, right? So here's another one. And so, Justine was talking about this area. I guess, Alex, you guys were talking about down here?
Yeah, south of Lake Madamascoit and a little bit north of Madamascoit, Alligator River.
Yeah, and then Alligator River, the canal here. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the site that's in this little red dot right here. And I use this map a lot, and I always like to also make the joke that, these are probably not good ways to talk about sea level rise and climate change, because it's, people don't like these kinds of maps. But anyway, we've talked about these ditches a good amount, and really how a lot of this got started, right? The way Emily and I started talking about saltwater intrusion was because we were experiencing saltwater intrusion in this restored wetland. And at first we didn't realize it. It was going for about a year and a half before we actually realized we were studying this restored wetland in this area. So here's the water level in gray, and then the symbols are the conductivity. And so there was a drought in 2007, 2008, and the conductivity went up in all three different sites. Another drought in 2008, 2009, and conductivity went up really high in the outflow, and not as much in the midpoint or the inflow. And this is because as part of the restoration, they removed the pump. So they had all these ditches. This area was actively pumped for it to be in agriculture. And as part of the restoration, they removed the pump, and that facilitated the movement of salt water into the area during drought periods. So, we're talking about hydrologic connectivity. Usually we like hydrologic connectivity, right? But there are times when hydrologic connectivity can have negative consequences. And this was, a salinity of about 6 parts per thousand, which is really high for this area. And we know that the salinity was coming in through the surface water and not through groundwater, because I also had piezometers at different depths. And we looked at the chloride concentrations of those, and we saw salinity in the 15 centimeters. But as we went down to 30, 60, or 100, there was really very little salinity. So the salinity was pretty much coming in through that surface water and not coming in through the groundwater. So I guess this fits more into the through rather than the under. Again, let's keep banging on the ditches, right? So this was work that postdoc Abby Vatachem, who was working with Ryan, did a while ago, where he mapped out the ditches in this area of the APP, and then he used some DEM modeling to try to figure out what the stream network used to look like. And then he calculated the saltwater intrusion vulnerability index, which has to do with the position in the landscape, the elevation, and then the area behind it for how much fresh water could come in and push out the salt water. And it's a little hard to see, but in these two areas, this is again what it is now. This is what we think it was before. And these warmer colors are showing that the ditches have increased the area of the landscape that's vulnerable to saltwater intrusion. And, we've seen that throughout and causing ghost forests and tree mortality. And I guess the last example I had an idea of this this is from Ryan's work again, and this is from Goose Creek State Park, which was the site that Justine was talking about, that after Hurricane Irene, there was a good amount of salt that came in, and it took, 6 or 7 months for that salinity to go back down because of those water control structures that Justine was talking about. And I think that's all I have. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Marcelo. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Is that correct, Kira?
Yeah, you can take like 15 too, if need be.
Awesome. Well, we can take 15. So I have a couple of questions, but before I ask any of my questions, I kind of want to open it up to the group for any questions or comments about the general presentation I gave, or any specific questions from any of the presentations. And feel free to type it in the chat and I'll read it, or just chime in.
I actually have a quick question. I guess this is kind of open to everybody. Maybe it's targeted more towards Alex and Marcelo. But so the work that I've done with saltwater intrusion hasn't really done much with soil. And I'm wondering, particularly with your work, Alex, you're looking a lot in agricultural fields. And I'm wondering if anyone has done any work about how agricultural practices change the structure of the soil, particularly thinking about porosity perhaps, and how maybe that could help explain some sort of patterning to saltwater intrusion.
Some of short answer is I'm not familiar of anyone who's done that in the literature, particularly in this area. And talking to the agriculture extension officers and agents, like that is something that it's really keen on their minds in terms of what that control is at that level. Because again, you might have a field that is impacted by storm surge, and so the entire field is inundated, but yet you have these pockets or these pockets where you have acute concentrations. And so is it the texture? Is it the structure? Is it also the microtopography in terms of some of those hypotheses? And so in thinking about some of the directions that we want to go, those are some of the things that we want to explore.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
I had a quick question for Alex also. Can I? Sorry if this is too much in the weeds. Oh, I'm sorry, Emily, you raised your hand. I'll stay quiet.
No, you go first, Marcelo. It's probably the same question.
Well, so the geophysical method and that image you were showing. So is that you're going down with depth? So were you showing that the salinity went like 2 meters below the ditch?
Yeah, so yes, so the two methods, right? So the first one kind of gives you like a map view, and so that's the EMI, and then the other one is the electroresistivity tomography, and so yeah, that's going to give you a cross section, and that goes. We can vary the spacings of our probes, and so based on how you vary the probes, you can go deeper, but less resolution, or shallower, more resolution. So for those ones, yeah, we went. It was more than 2 meters depth.
And that's just the conductivity of the soil, right?
Yes, exactly. The resistivity, but then conductivity is inverse, yeah.
I guess my question follows on that one, Alex, which is just we keep and you know, we were all part of these conversations at the all hands meeting about it's not just whether or not the salt gets somewhere, but does it stick, right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
so are there properties of these patches in your soils that are more likely to hold on to the marine salts or some of the ions so that it remains salty for longer, which to me is a super interesting part of this question.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, we've run the AMI, like looking at the map view, and also run, I didn't have time to show everything, and also run the tomography, which is a lot of work on the part of a student, and multiple times. And so, yeah, you do see different patterns. And some of the challenges, though, is that when you do run those techniques, right, they're giving you the conductivity, which could come from just the conductivity of the fluid, or the actual ions that are in the fluid, right, or the actual native elements in terms of the material properties. If you have clays, they'll give that. So part of the temporal is to tease out some of those other elements that we're sure we're looking at. It's just the salt, or it's a combination of. But again, yeah, one of the things that has been really interesting to look at is like, why do we have those patches? And some of them are persistent and some of them are not. And then why, what's driving that?
I'm going to raise my hand and call myself. So I'm interested in continuing this line of thought, but in a different way. So one thing that's interesting about this group is we've got folks focused on the surface processes and the ground processes, but we still haven't like seen that integration in our case studies. And we have a couple of groundwater folks on the paper, but they just weren't, didn't talk today. And one thing, Alex, as you were talking and looking at your geophysical, in whatever the geophysical results and the conductivity, and I had never really thought of this, and seeing Marcelo reminding me of Hurricane Irene, is that as we salinize, as we make our surface water salty, is there more of a connection to the groundwater through what used to be freshwater systems? I tend to think about groundwater salinization always coming in from the coast, but I don't know, James and Jeevan, you all are both here. Is there any thought about making our groundwater resources saltier simply because we're making our lakes and streams saltier, and that's where we're pulling groundwater, and groundwater pulls from those systems too?
I mean, I can say that I've thought about it. I was wondering with this gigantic saltwater wedge in the Mississippi earlier this year, how much aquifer that might have salinized just by having that wedge sitting in the river for a big chunk of the year. But I talked with Kevin Beefus about this actually at AGU, and he wasn't aware of anybody who had actually done work on that. So
Holly, go ahead.
Everyone, Holly. This was great. Thanks for this. I haven't been able to come to many of these, so this is really fun. We've actually done some work on that. And what we found is that, right, Ashley, you think of this sort of traditional subsurface wedge of saltwater coming in, but actually the main pathway for groundwater saltwater intrusion that we've seen in the coastal sites that we're monitoring is actually the tidal streams. And so we're seeing saltwater going further up the tidal streams, and then during most of the year in our streams, the streams are gaining from the groundwater. So if you get a lot of saltwater coming up, it may not, on average go in, but we also have a lot of groundwater pumping, groundwater use. And so when you start to reverse those gradients, especially as sea level rises, then we think that's a primary pathway for saltwater intrusion for the groundwater, and probably much faster and more extensive, especially more inland than that traditional wedge, which for us is like out under the marsh somewhere. So really the salt to the groundwater is coming through those channels.
Yeah, that's super cool, Holly. I would love to have your insight on that. I think at least in the group we're in right now, we're still kind of very separately surface water, groundwater, but I think any kind of expertise and insight we can pull in with the connections either way, right? Either where surface seawater intrusion is moving salinity into the groundwater system, or where salty groundwater at base flow is moving into fresh surface water systems. I think those connections are really important. So it'd be great to chat with you further about that. Alex, you have your hand up.
So for the field site that we have, we also have instrumented several monitoring wells that are nested, so at different depths. And so for some of those, again, I didn't have time to show all those data. But some of those wells do, and this is a shallow aquifer. So in North Carolina, we've got different series of aquifer. For the ones that provide water to the population, they are going to be much deeper, like the Cretaceous aquifers that the state ultimately said we need to reduce the stress on that because we were having, again, saltwater intrusion problems and declining water levels. And so we've transitioned more to the Castlehane and surface water bodies. But then for this site, it's in the superficial. And so the superficial is maybe several meters deep or so at this location. And then once we run, once we put in the piezometers, we're able to monitor the salinity over time. And so for some of them, we might have some elevated salinity readings. And then for some of, depending on the heights, right, some of them it's more fresh. But then there doesn't seem to be a great connectivity for the ones that elevate in terms of groundwater with respect to the surface. And so there is some clay lenses that separate the connectivity between those shallow sediments and the deeper ones based on the piezometers. And then, so what we're expecting to see again over time is that, let's say if you had an influx of water from storm surge, that ultimately our sensors would pick up that signal from the surface water, but they're just flat. They don't pick up anything from surface water. And then initially, when we had installed the monitoring system, we were looking at surface water bodies and then just the groundwater. And then we didn't see anything. Then was like, well, we need to go into the actual vadose zone, into the soil layer. So we had some soil moisture sensors. And so we then installed soil moisture sensors to then capture that gap there. And so obviously soil moisture sensors are more responsive to precipitation and moisture influxes. But then again, you don't see the signal sort of propagating all the way down from the surface through the soil moisture sensors to the groundwater system. And so that's specific for this particular site. For the broader scheme in terms of North Carolina, so the major driver, if you talk to Richard Spruill, who was at ECU and is sort of puts wells everywhere, the concern has been pumping groundwater from deep aquifers and that then changing those gradients and then drawing salt water in. And so now many municipalities are like, we'll just leave with it. And then they just even target, those salty aquifers and just use reverse osmosis to make potable water.
I really love the addition of really pointedly using this article, Ashley, to think about how these are not distinct pathways.
So I think just kind of pulling back out to the paper, there are kind of two aspects of the paper that as I've been working through this and reading like all of the thank you all the people that have left comments and citations, that's been so helpful. But two of the things that have really struck me that are I think really important and missing from the paper are this idea of the bidirectional exchange between salty groundwater and fresh surface water, or salty surface water and fresh groundwater as pathways for salinization is really important and underappreciated. I didn't know, Holly, I'm sorry, I didn't know about your work. I already clicked on the paper and read the abstract, so I'm very excited to read that. I did not know about your work, so it's super nice to meet you. And then the second thing I've been struggling with, and this was, I think, a question Emily posed before, is the original vision of the group was hydrologic pathways that deliver salt. But we all know that says something about the risk of salinization, but the second part of that are the hydrologic and other pathways that retain salt, right? Those can be structures that dam water, they can be structures that retain the water and thus the salt, but it can also be based on characteristics of soils, right, or sediments that retain more salt than others. And so I've been struggling with kind of those two things and how we pull those messages out in this paper, both the connection between groundwater and surface water systems as mechanisms for salt delivery, and that it's not just about delivery, but it's that it's about retention. And can we get all of that across in 2,000 words and 2 figures? Marcelo's face says no, but we're going to try.
So the question is, how many panels per figure?
As far as I can tell, as many as you want. So for case studies, it would be great. I know we're out of time, so I'll just kind of give a recap. So first, thank you everybody that spoke today. It was really wonderful to hear all those case studies and for us to kind of think through some of these processes. So first, thanks for that. Second, as I said, please feel free to opt in as an author. We have a lot of North Carolina specific case studies right now and a couple of other on the books. It would be great to expand that a little bit, especially those case studies that bring in human modifications that we don't highlight in the paper, and also the groundwater surface water connectivity. This is what happens when I don't have notes. There was a third point I wanted to make at the end. If it's important, it'll come back to me. So any parting thoughts or questions before I turn it back over to Kiera for her requested last 5 minutes? Okay, so I'm going to take the silence as a no. I see some messages popping up in the chat, which I will read after I hand it over. Thank you all.
Yeah, that was so much fun to listen to everybody's case studies and the discussions afterwards. And I was going to say, I always hate taking time away from discussions and kind of helpful conversations. So this Zoom room can stay open for as long as people want, if you want to stay on and kind of continue to chat. But within my last 5 minutes, I really just wanted to highlight that our next webinar will be March 8th. So I just wanted to give a little ad and a shout out that Friday, March 8th at noon, we will have 2 projects that are both focused on creating kind of databases. The first one is Anna Braswell's project, which is the Center for Climate Scenarios. The final title is to be determined, but this is an effort to curate data, resources, stories, and experts that might be needed for residents who are affected by Swizzler when they're trying to make informed decisions about their resilient future. And the second presentation will either be given by Carrie Gadan or Jerry Parent, which they will present on their project, the Coastal Depot, which is short for Coastal Database of Edaphic and Plant Transitions. So both of those will be presented on March 8th. And then just a final reminder to hold the June 13th and 14th for our all hands working group, where we can work on projects like this paper that Ashley Heldon was talking about today, or other projects that we've been talking about through these webinars. So thank you all for joining, and we'll see you again in a month. And like I said before, you can stick around and use this Zoom room to chat if you wish. But thank you all.